So I'm going to talk a bit about the image of the Chinese misbehaving tourist, and if they are really misbehaving, and if so, what the reason for that is. Here we go. First, if you are interested in crazy China news, follow the website Shanghaiist. They've got a lot of very interesting, sometimes funny, sometimes offensive stuff. But they also, in the last couple of years, they've printed a lot of news items about Chinese tourists that were misbehaving in different countries. And these 4 here were all news items that were related to Chinese tourists that were on a plane and opened the emergency exit. Why? Because they thought it was the toilet, because they wanted some fresh air, or because they were actually already landed and it was, according to them, taking too long for the people to leave the plane, so they wanted a quick way out. I think that most of these cases had to do with just not being experienced very much in the surroundings they were in. But it is actually quite scary to hear this if you're also on that plane. This was a person that used his battery of his laptop and he made it look like it was a gun, and he was on that plane and he was posting that on social media. I think he was immediately taken off the plane and he didn't reach the destination he was going to. This was some news about a group of Chinese tourists that were stuck in an airport in Thailand, and they were so pissed off by the delay that they thought it would help if they would all together sing the Chinese national anthem. Didn't really help, by the way. These are all different news items about fights that break out on planes, about people that throw hot noodle water over a stewardess, a flight attendant. So quite scary as well. This is a news item about a Chinese young boy, a teenager, that was traveling with his parents to Egypt. And in Luxor, in the Karnak temple, this boy thought it was a good idea to carve his name into a very old relief. So what you also see quite often is these news items about Chinese people visiting other countries, and seemingly they have a lot of trouble finding the toilet. So maybe that's why they're sending you those questions where the toilet is. And of course, especially if this happens in places like Taiwan or in Hong Kong, the local media and the local social media use that as a way to criticize the mainland Chinese. A new trend, which just happened a couple of times, twice this year, is, like I said, you have more and more older people also traveling. And it's happened twice this year that old grannies, for good luck, just throw some change into the engine of the airplane. For good luck. So you can see that there's a lot of these news items going around, and I want to talk a bit about the reasons why these things happen, because instead of just criticizing this kind of behavior, I think it's also very important for us to understand where it's coming from. I want to give you one more example, and I'm going to explain what is happening here later on. This is a Chinese tour group in Thailand at an all-you-can-eat buffet, where they have just served shrimps. And of course, this is something that, when things like these happen, I can assure you that there's a lot of people in China that feel very embarrassed by these things. They feel very embarrassed by it. In the Netherlands last year, there was a research that was done by Vakantiedeals. It's an online travel website. And they asked the Dutch travelers, who do you find the most annoying and the most irritating people you meet on your vacation? Well, of course, the Dutch are in there as well, because we can seemingly also quite be misbehaving. The English, with their binge drinking when they are on holiday, score high. The Russians, well, I already heard people mention the Russians here. But the Chinese, even though they're not that big in number yet compared to other nationalities, are already in third place. And when they ask those people, what are the things that annoy you? This is what they call a word cloud. So the biggest words were the things that were most often mentioned. So it's things that had to do with taking pictures. Big groups, spitting, antisocial behavior, being very present, very annoying, very loud, being rude and uncivilized. So these are things that people think about when they talk about Chinese tourists. As a matter of fact, the Chinese National Tourist Administration Office did some research themselves. So they also asked around and they wanted to know what are the things that are mentioned most about annoying behavior of the Chinese tourist. And it's making a lot of noise, making a lot of racket, cutting in line, so not waiting for your turn, disrespect for local culture and local customs, spitting in public places, urinating and defecating everywhere because you cannot find a toilet, littering, speaking impolitely, taking photos when they are not allowed to be taken, like in museums where you have very expensive artwork, for instance, that can be damaged by flash photography, smoking in public places. 60% of all Chinese males smoke. There's a lot of places in China, in restaurants, where it's not allowed to smoke, but it's very easy also to go to China and take a picture of a guy that's sitting in a restaurant smoking beneath a no smoking sign. So it's very easy. And a very important one that you often see is not remaining rational when you're not satisfied. There's a certain sense of entitlement that you sometimes see that leads to even sometimes very aggressive behavior. The Chinese people themselves are very embarrassed when they read these news items themselves. But the Chinese government has also said that they think that the quality of the Chinese tourist really needs to improve. So what they've done is, one of the things they've done is they've made a brochure a few years ago, which they handed out to Chinese tourists going abroad. And it was very much cartoon style, and it very much showed the Chinese tourist what they should and should not do when they traveled abroad. It even went up to advice to clip your nose hair. Make sure that your nose hair is not too long when you visit Europe. They also, what they did is they made a blacklist. They said, if you have any of these behaviors and we find out, then you go on a blacklist and you're not allowed to travel for 5 years anymore. So if you interfere with that emergency exit on the aircraft, or if you damage public facilities, or you offend local traditions or culture or living habits, you destroy those beautiful relics in a temple like in Karnak in Egypt. Even though it might be allowed to gamble, or go to a prostitute or use drugs in the Netherlands, we still don't want you to do it. Don't threaten the public safety. Don't damage the ecosystem. So also no littering. No low taste or superstitious ideas. So please don't throw your small change into an engine of an airplane. And other behavior that causes negative impact. China is working very hard. The Chinese government is working very hard, not very successful at all times, but to improve the image of their own society. And they want to root out this problem of the Chinese misbehaving tourist. But I think that besides sort of judging this behavior, I think also for ourselves, because we are receiving these people as customers, it's very important to try and understand where it comes from. So I'm going to give you a couple of explanations where this behavior comes from. First of all, I think it's important to realize that the average Chinese person has a lack of experience with other cultures. In most of China, you will find that I think it's something like 92% of Chinese people are Han Chinese. So it's one ethnic group. And most of the minorities live either in the north, in Inner Mongolia, in the south, in Yunnan, in Tibet, in Xinjiang. So they live on the fringes of the country. But the majority of the country, the center of the country where most of the people also live, is Han Chinese. And they are not very familiar, even within their own country, with people of other cultures, of other ethnic groups. As a matter of fact, when they travel to Yunnan, they expect to find a lot of dressed up minority people that do some dancing performances at night as part of their experience. So that's quite often, to the average Chinese, the only experience they have with different cultures. Even if you, as a foreigner, you must have experienced that as well, Thijs. If you, as a foreigner, if you live in China, you will have people pointing at you and shouting "Lao Wai," which means foreigner, and not the most polite way of addressing a foreigner. So what I did is I would point back and say "Zhongguoren," so Chinese. But it's even in that way they don't understand that it can feel very threatening or offensive. So it's a lack of experience. So just imagine that they go to a completely different country with different cultures and different habits. The second thing is that this, as I showed you at the beginning of the afternoon, is something that is booming only since a couple of years. So you all of a sudden have very large groups that go on these airplanes and go to hotels, and it's the first time they experience that. And they sometimes don't even know how to behave if they wanted to. Besides that, what you also have, especially in those groups, is group behavior. And group behavior, you sort of, if you're part of the group, it's like you're not individually responsible anymore. So you can behave like the rest of the group does. And that's very strong in Chinese culture. It also has to do a bit, again, with the Cultural Revolution. You had to stay part of the group. As soon as you stuck out your head, it would be chopped off, even if that would make other people feel safer. So my wife, at one point when I was traveling in Sri Lanka, I was stung by a dengue mosquito. So I was sick in bed. And there was a group of Chinese grannies that were making a lot of racket in the hall. And she, a Chinese person as well, went to them and very kindly asked, can you please keep it down a bit, because my husband is sick and he's trying to get some sleep. And what they said to her is, 你是谁? In this, who are you? Who are you to ask this? Yeah, I'm a customer here as well. I'm also staying in this hotel. Go and talk to our group leader. So also that the leader is seemingly responsible for the behavior of the whole group. So it's very, very strongly a factor in this behavior. Another one, if you look at those, the fight for those shrimps and the cutting in line, has to do a lot with the intense competition that people feel in the Chinese society. If you study as a young Chinese boy or girl in middle school, you have to get the highest score on the Gaokao, which is the entrance examination for the university. If you don't get a very high score, you will not go to a good university, or you might not go to a university at all. And if you're lucky, get some vocational training.
It starts in kindergarten.
Yeah, it starts, and nowadays it starts even there. And if you have these tiger moms that are sort of pushing their kids to learn piano and violin and English. So there's a lot of pressure on the people there. Then when they finally graduate, then they come on the labor market, and there's actually not enough jobs, well-paying jobs, for the number of students that graduate. So then they compete with each other again. And throughout the last couple of decades, there's a constant feeling of having to fight for your right, for what's yours, to get a piece of the Chinese pie. And that's why Chinese people think that if you wait in line, there will always be other people that will cut the line and get in front of you. So that's where this behavior comes from. Another thing that's about the spitting. It is something that you especially see with older people and people from rural areas. The young people don't do it that much anymore. Even though I was in a sauna once in China, and somebody that was sitting next to me was spitting on the ground of the sauna floor, where you sort of like... So things like that happen. But why do they do it? Especially the older generations, they believe, because Chinese medicine have told them that any kind of slime should be removed from the body as soon as possible. So, and they have this almost obsessive behavior of constantly doing that, not even sometimes being aware that they're doing that. The government, though, has informed a lot of people that it can spread diseases and that it's not civilized behavior. So you see that it slowly, especially in the younger generations, is starting to disappear from China. Another thing, what we've also seen is what Bart was telling about, the very low budget trips that are now offered to people that want to travel. And that also attracts a certain kind of tourist, a certain kind of consumer that might not be very well educated and might have even less experience with other cultures. So all of this, basically, it's not really that the Chinese people are misbehaving, they're just behaving like they do at home. It's not like they go out across the border and say, okay, let's have a party now, and there's no rules anymore. They are just behaving the way they do at home. So, and then again, it's a cultural aspect, so it's all relative. So what is good and what is bad? What I normally do when I go to another country, and these are a couple of books I bought when I went to China as a volunteer, as an international volunteer, I read Culture Shock, and I read The Xenophobe's Guide to the Chinese. It's one I can really recommend, because in a humorous way, it gives you a lot of information about the psyche, the way of thinking of the Chinese people. And if you do read this, and there's probably also one for Belgium, But if you're Dutch, read the Xenophobe's Guide to the Dutch. Especially if you are Belgian, you should read this as well. You will have a great time. You will have read the one about Belgian people as well. But this tells you so much about your own behavior which you do not realize. And the Dutch people, we saw that we scored quite well on being quite annoying. There's a Japanese saying, and Japanese might be the most polite people in the world. There's a Japanese saying, where a Dutchman has walked, no grass will ever grow again. Because we're that rude, we're that direct, we're that rude. So when I travel, I do a lot of reading before I actually go to a country. So when I go to places like India and when I go to places like Thailand, I have done a lot of reading. But sometimes even then you make mistakes that you don't realize. In this case, this was my first trip to Thailand. And I decided it would be a cool idea to sit in front of a Buddha statue in the same posture he has and have my picture taken. Not realizing, even though I'd done a lot of reading, that it's extremely disrespectful to do this. And if somebody would have seen me doing that, then I might have been in trouble. The picture on the right is me at the Golden Temple in Amritsar in India. This is a temple of the Sikh religion. And the Sikhs have a very special way of welcoming other people that don't have their religion to this temple. But they even invite you to come and have dinner with them. They serve everybody that visits the temple a dinner because they believe that when you sit down and you eat together, that brings the people together. That creates unity and community. So I went there, and you have to take off your shoes before you go in. You walk around. It's a very serene place, one of the most special places I've been to. And I knew that in India, your feet are the most dirtiest part of your body, considered to be quite unholy. So when I sat down at one moment, and I was just hanging my feet over the edge a bit, and they were pointing towards the holy temple, I was approached by a couple of Indian people that told me, hey, you should not be pointing your feet to this temple. And I had been reading about this, but I had just forgotten about it. This was not done on purpose. So a lot of the misbehavior and these mistakes that Chinese people make are also just because of lack of experience and just not realizing what they're doing. So if you go to a Chinese restaurant and in Amsterdam and you read this, to most of us it wouldn't mean anything. But if you know what it says, please throw your toilet paper with feces into the toilet and flush it away. And you would think, yeah, of course. Why does this need to be there? Or why does this sign need to be there? Why does this sign need to be on the toilet? Of course you sit down on the toilet and you don't do it like this. But when you're from China, you're used to do this, and you stay on a public toilet. This is a very clean public toilet, by the way. So most of them don't have doors. If they have doors, they're always open, and there's always some person that is taking a dump while being on his phone and talking to somebody else. But this is how people, especially in the poorer areas, are going to the toilet. They are squatting, and they also know that you shouldn't put the toilet paper in the toilet because it clogs up the sewage. So again, they are trying to do the right thing, not realizing what they're doing. There's a couple of things that create like extremes. So the one-child policy has created a situation where you have one child with 2 parents and 4 grandparents, and all of the attention is on this one kid. So that creates also what you might have heard, little emperors that are really, they are so used to getting everything they want. And whenever you hear something in the news about a Chinese person misbehaving, and he feels entitled to something, it's most of the time it's either a little emperor or what they call a Er Dai. That's the second generation rich. So the children of the first Chinese people that have gotten rich, and they have a certain sense of entitlement. You also have the so-called Tuhao. And a Tuhao is basically, as they describe it in China, a farmer that got rich but not civilized. So they are the ones that wear all of the bling bling. They are the ones that have the golden iPhones. So these are some of the people that are also creating the problems. But there are extremes, and they are exceptions to the rule. So what we should be thinking about is what can we do to solve this problem? One of the first things that you can do, especially if you're a destination, is to work together with the tour guides. and with tour agencies, because they are the ones, especially for the groups, that can educate the Chinese people. Chinese people also spend a lot of time on the bus for instance, in Holland. If they spend a night in Amsterdam, they go on the bus and they drive all the way to Roermond to do some shopping in an outlet shop and all the way back. So they spend about 3 hours on the bus doing that. So you can show them maybe some videos, so you can tell them some stories, and you can work together with tour agencies and tour guides to do that. What you can also do is at your own location. There's very simple things you can do to communicate with them. Get some information, have it translated into Chinese, and create, for instance, a QR code. A QR code is very easy to create. If you put the information on your website, just on a page that might not even be visible when you visit your website, and you go to a QR code generator online, you can translate your website into a QR code. And you can put that on the table, on the door, you can put that in a brochure, and believe me, Chinese people will be so curious to scan that QR code because they want to know what's behind it, and especially if you say that it has some kind of great promotion or discount, they will do that. And that's one way to try and communicate with them. Positive segregation. A very good example is the one that Bart gave earlier on, by putting those Chinese tourists in a separate room because they tried to get them away from the other tourists that thought they were eating too noisily, but they themselves, the Chinese tourists themselves, saw it as a VIP treatment. So that is the way you communicate things. You could also create positive segregation. And you can use a lot of signs. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of language signs. This is a language sign that I saw in Kinderdijk in Holland, where you have all of the windmills. But some of those windmills are not actually part of the museum. People are living there. So what they've done is they've put a sign, doorgang verboden, no trespassing, and in Chinese as well. The same goes in Giethoorn. Sometimes Chinese people don't realize that it's not a museum, but people are actually living there. So they come into the garden, they might actually walk into your kitchen. So the inhabitants of Giethoorn are putting signs in their gardens, please don't trespass, please don't come here. That might be like the first thing you could do. Also, this is one again in Sri Lanka saw. It says Qing Anjing. Anjing means quiet, silence, so please be silent. But what they did is something that also appeals to Chinese people, they included an emoticon, which makes it much more friendly to them as well, and possibly also attracts more attention. Then, when you go to Giethoorn, there's a school right next to the parking lot. And a lot of Chinese people would go to that school and, see those cute children. And they were taking lots of pictures and sending that back home. Of course, the school wasn't quite happy with that. But so they just hang up a sign, no pictures. And that already helped quite a lot. But it doesn't mean that it always helps. This is a picture that I took. I'm not sure if I took it in the Forbidden City or in the Summer Palace in Beijing. But it's very clear that this says in Chinese, dangerous, no climbing. Yeah. Which for a Chinese person is a suggestion, which you might follow or not. So not always signs will help. But I want to close off with one example that I found in Biasha in Guizhou. And there's this sign that says, forbidden to leave trash. Forbidden to leave trash. Well, this wouldn't help. This would be a suggestion. If it's a bit more threatening, and it says, those who break the rule will be fined 3,000 yuan. Nobody there. No, just leave it anyway. Nobody's watching. But if you say, report somebody and get rewarded 2,000 yuan, after we verify that this person really was, this goes back to, which is also ingrained in the Chinese psyche. There's a bit of a ratting culture as well, and it also comes from the Cultural Revolution, where sometimes to be safe, it would be good to cheat on somebody else or to tell on somebody else. So this place was totally clean. There was nothing, no litter to be found whatsoever, because maybe somebody from the village might be watching you. And that's also what's going on in China itself with a lot of surveillance cameras. They can find you and they can spot you and they can punish you within a matter of minutes. Finally, authority. You can use authority, fines and threaten with enforcement. So that's what I want to close off with. take things into consideration from a cultural perspective. There's a couple of tips what you could do, but don't just judge, but also try to understand it. It will not make it nicer, but it will make it more understandable.